Hello and welcome to episode 69 of Prose. This week, experience true vulnerability with a different sort of couple and consider a much different take on one of the major events in William Shakespeare's Hamlet. I will forego my usual pleas for everyone to leave ratings, reviews, and to subscribe, and I will simply beg you all this. Share this show with one person. One person that likes podcasts, that enjoys fiction, that likes DIY projects, that is bored on their commute. One person that is a literature fiend. Just someone. Try to do so this week. That can go a very, very long way, and I can't tell you how much that would mean to me. Alright, thank you for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week we have The Amended and Lane. Enjoy. The Amended, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Stintz inserted the ribbed key into his chest and turned it to his right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There it was. He was now ready to tackle another 23 hours. The winding of his internal gears was a major inconvenience, he thought, but then again, he also knew that a great many had much more burdensome amendments. He worked with a woman that had to recalibrate her internal gyroscope once every 6 hours, and that took about 2 hours in and of itself. That recalibration required her to be absolutely still in order to optimize balance and proper neutral distribution. So, the poor thing had essentially been doomed to having every day for the rest of her days being divided into thirds. If something could not be fully done in 6 hours, she could not do it. He also had heard tell of a man that had to fully decompress his chest due to regular atmospheric and barometric changes throughout the day. The word on this gentleman was that he had to lift the inner workings of his chest cavity out to recharge or depressurize or something in a chemical solution. How this rumored man stayed living while he was in pieces was not part of the lore that passed around the Amended, but Stintz could only wonder at just how difficult that man's life must be. His 5 cranks a day were nothing he should be upset about in the long run then. He thought often on the inner and outer workings of others like him that had required or been mandated or simply elected to go through the amending process. Stintz marveled at the ingenuity of the engineers, surgeons, and metallurgists and craftsmen's works. The world was so much better for the variety and order that amending brought to the peoples that populated it. Of course, there were many that thought the amended were unnatural, but they were going to be on the wrong side of history. That is what the engineer said in his weekly radio address, and Stintz believed him. Why wouldn't he? Progress was always slowed by those unwilling or unable to evolve. That was what the engineer said, too. Life was stable for Stintz. Wake, get ready, wind his gears. Eat breakfast and make his lunch. Walk to work. Job at the local process servery. Working lunch, walk home, eat dinner, get ready, wind his gears, sleep. That made his meeting Evelina Dirigible all the more momentous. Stintz had simply decided to take a more circuitous route home on a Tuesday evening when he had been caught in the rain. Now, his gears wouldn't be ruined if they got wet, but the oiling process to ensure that rust did not begin to creep into him was arduous and time-consuming. So Stintz hurtled under the nearest awning, which just so happened to be the overhang of the local branch of the District Trust Bank. To his surprise and delight, there, underneath that very same awning, was a beautiful woman. She was wearing a light pink dress that was very modest. It ran down to her ankles, reached to her wrists, and climbed all the way to the lower part of her neck. Delicate white lace framed the various rims of the dress, and she was wearing a rather stylish hat with a pink tuft of feather on it too. This woman looked like something out of a bygone era. That, or she looked like someone so forward-thinking that she was getting the jump on what everyone would see was the next trend to launch from the newsstands off of next month's Fashion and Phantasms magazine. Stintz didn't have much luck with women, and he definitely didn't have much practice speaking to them. This close, this unexpectedly. He gulped and gathered his courage. Bad storm, huh?
Oh, yes, sir. I knew it was coming. And yet I was still caught. Funny how the best planning by we mere mortals is often thrown by the wayside by the gods.
Funny, yeah. Is it supposed to last a while?
I don't believe so. Sudden downpours are all the rage in April, are they not? Poems and lyrics and cliches being formed around it, what?
Yeah, I guess so.
Oh, hi. My name is Stintz Bearden. Nice to make your acquaintance. Very kind of you to introduce yourself, sir. Very gentlemanly. My name is Evelina Dirigible. Very, very nice to meet you, Mr. Bearden.
Oh, please call me Stintz. He grinned like a fool, took Evelina Dirigible's hand and shook it just a little too vigorously. She smiled, and though the smile did feel a bit forced, it was maintained. That alone gave Stintz all the prompting he needed to continue the conversation. Looking back, he couldn't remember what all they had talked about. It was a blur all these months now having passed. The one thing his memory could alight on was that he had brought up his gears, that he was amended. Evelina Dirigible had not cringed. She had not inquired further. She had not smiled and shared her own stories of amendment. She had not run. She had not warmed. In fact, the most memorable aspect of his telling her was her utter and complete lack of reaction. Because of the somewhat charged atmosphere around the engineer and his grand designs, most people tried hard to be inclusive or kind if they were accepting of the amended. Those that weren't, well, they were far from pleasant, and they certainly wouldn't be caught dead shaking hands and sharing an awning with what they saw as befouled hellspawn, would they? From the lack of reaction, Stintz had made an educated guess that Evelina Dirigible was not amended herself. She certainly didn't show it with an outer peace or prominence. The downpour had ended far too promptly for Stintz to be able to inquire about her feelings about the amended. The rain had stopped, she said it had been a pleasure, and she was gone. With her departure came a sense of profound loss for Stintz. This took him aback. He had only just barely met this woman, barely interacted with her, and he was already aching at her absence. He knew this was trouble for his poor and experienced heart, but he still couldn't help but be enamored with her. He began to daydream about their first date, their engagement, their overly ostentatious wedding that her absurdly rich father insisted upon financing, their children, too, a boy and a girl, and on and on. His fantasy spread out to old age and eternity. This pining went on for 3 weeks when, miracle of miracles, he ran into her again. He had, in all truth, continued walking that same path on which he met her that wet day in hopes of seeing her again, but he had begun to lose heart that his search would ever bear fruit. But, on a cloudy Thursday afternoon, he saw Evelina Dirigible making her way down the sidewalk toward him. She was wearing a lilac version of the same prim and proper dress with lace fringe that she'd been wearing when he'd fallen deeply in love with her. He slowed his pace down so as not to seem too eager, and set his pace to ensure their paths crossed.
Well, I'll be! Evelina Dirigible! Hello, my lady!
Stintz performed a miniature bow and smiled his wildest, kindest smile.
Why, you are that Mr. Bearden from the rainstorm a while back. What a strange coincidence! How do you do, sir? Well, I'm well. And you, madam? How kind of you to ask, and so mannerly in the doing so. I find that young men of our age often forego manners for convenience and out of ignorance. It shows bad breeding and bad prospects. Well met, Mr. Bearden. To answer your inquiry, I, too, am well, though I fear that the drudgery of daily life has made my own existence quite droll of late. But now I'm going on too much, aren't I? This was very rude of me, Mr. Bearden, very rude indeed. I sincerely apologize for my presumptuousness and forward nature. Evelina Dirigible was going so fast in this flurry of words and sentiment that Stintz could barely keep up. When he did catch up, he realized that she was blushing furiously, no longer meeting his eyes, and making as if she were about to leave. Why no, Miss Dirigible. I understand how daily repetition can indeed become droll, and I am more than happy to speak with you a bit about it. We all need a supportive friend from time to time, after all. Oh, and please do call me Stintz. Mr. Bearden makes me sound so old and stuffy. Firstly, you are a kind man for saying that you are willing to listen to my paltry problems. We are but one step removed from strangers, and I feel a kinship with you already. I shall go on then, as I am feeling that I am in need of your aforementioned supportive friendship today. Secondly, I think that the honorific Mr. brings naught but grace and dignity to your already strong last name, but, since you are insisting, I shall begin to refer to you as Stintz. You remembered my full name. Well, of course I did that is Stintz. I am a proper lady, and a proper lady must not forget an acquaintance's name. Wouldn't that just be the heights of rudeness? We must be fair and egalitarian in our relationship, correct? In all our relationships, correct? Thusly, in this particular case, you must refer to me as Evelina. Though it might seem forward and familiar, you may call me Evie, a name reserved for those I favor most. Would you care to stroll while we converse? And they did. They walked up and down every wide avenue and cobbled boulevard and wharf-lined street they could. They spoke of Evelina's problems with drollness and the ins and outs of her life. They spoke of their careers, apartments, pasts, presents, and futures. In no time, 2 hours had passed, and Stintz had the opportunity to ask her what she thought of Amending. As it turned out, she looked at it rather favorably and spoke highly of those that had chosen to take up the engineer's teachings and be a part of the next step of human evolution. With this outpouring of support for the movement and the underlying practices, Stintz opened up to Evelina about his own amending, what it entailed, how it affected his daily life, pros, cons, everything about it really. He was extremely surprised when she, in her same measured tones, as always, proper and seemingly removed from all things low, base, and blasé, cadenced out that she too was amended. That is where the line of conversation stopped, though. They continued to walk and talk until the sun had all but set. Then Stintz walked her to a transport station, wished her a good evening, began to walk away, rushed back to beg to see her again, got her assent, and then he skipped all the way home. Much as in his fantasy, their first real date went well and quickly became another and another and yet another. They began seeing one another as much as possible. Rather than work through lunch at his desk all alone, Stintz and Evelina would meet up for a quick chat, a quick bite, and some time together. After only 3 months of dating, both seemed relatively confident that this was going to lead to something far more serious and far more permanent. Stintz couldn't say the M word, but Evelina, ever the rational, measured one, did not shy away from giving him the logical timeline and how-tos of what their courtship need be. The only aspect of their relationship that Stintz found odd was that he'd never been to her apartment. She came by his apartment all the time now. In fact, she had a key and felt very comfortable coming and going as she pleased. She redecorated. She painted one of his kitchen walls in a striking mural of the docks they loved to walk by, just so they could have dinner in their favorite spot every night. Evie was a fixture in his life and therefore a fixture in his apartment. She, on the other hand, never wanted to have Stintz anywhere near her living quarters, as she most often called her domicile.
She balked at the two of them spending time there for any reason whatsoever. So, on the day of their official 4th anniversary, Stintz was speechless when Evelina invited him over to her living quarters to share in a celebratory meal. When the evening came, Stintz arrived 10 minutes early, just the way Evelina liked, and he just couldn't call her Evie in his own head. He honored her request out loud, but his angel would always be Evelina in his own thoughts. And upon arrival, he was remarkably impressed with the unremarkability of her building, her hall, her door, and then, yes, her apartment. Beige walls with gray accents, the general lamps one could buy at the commissariat, furniture that had come packaged from a mass box store. Nothing was out of the ordinary. She had cooked him a pasta dinner with all sorts of aromatic herbs and biting spices, both of which must have cost her a pretty penny at the restricted goods market. But even that was not abnormal for Evelina. She enjoyed cooking, and she did not skimp when it came time to put art onto a plate. Dinner was normal and pleasant. Conversation was typical and warm. Their discussion of the radio broadcast from the engineer calling for volunteers in a newly formed safety check squad to help the general well-being of the Amended was heavy but intellectually engaging, as their discussions on such important issues generally were. Everything was as it had always been. Everything was heavenly to Stintz. It was when Evelina looked at him with her large dark eyes with a fire and hunger that he'd never seen before that Stintz realized that something momentous was meant to happen here in her quarters. She'd invited him into her own intimate space for a reason. Sex? They'd been waiting for a while now. He'd assumed that was because she was very proper and logical and traditioned, buttoned up, if you will. But was this her throwing caution to the wind? Stintz went still and waited to see what his cue would be, and if that might clarify her intensity she was throwing at him through her stare.
Stintz, tonight must be a special night. Though anniversaries are relatively banal and rely heavily on the artificial construct of time, it is a night of celebration for us, as well it should be, no?
Well, of course, Evie.
As such, I have invited you into my living quarters so that you could see my domicile, how I live, and one of the 3 remaining pieces of who I am. Now, I must show you the penultimate piece to me, since we are meant to be cultivating our intimacy ahead of our inevitable nuptials.
Then, he saw her falter. He saw doubt cross over Evelina's face for what he thought must be the first time in all the months they'd known each other. Are you okay, Ev? You don't have to do this, you know. I'm so happy just being with you, and according to your plan, we'll be getting married in no time, and sex can wait.
No, Stintz. Tonight is not a night when we should take part in our first shared coital interaction. This is much more important and much more intimate.
Evelina began to unbutton the top of her high-necked dress, reaching her arms behind herself and deftly popping each little fastener. She peeled the top half of her dress down, her modest white bra shining in the lamplight, letting the dress hang down from her waist, securely resting on her hips. Stintz maintained his eye contact with her, wanting her to see his resolute support of her decision to do whatever it was she was doing that was not sex yet somehow involved her removing her clothing. Evelina moved to take her bra off, and with that Stintz colored and swallowed hard. His mind raced and his stomach was suddenly full of rocks, then butterflies, then firecrackers. As her bra came off, he was struck by her breasts. His someday wife was gorgeous. He'd not seen too many women unclothed, yet he still did not doubt that his Evelina was a goddess above and beyond all other women he'd ever known or could ever know. It was only after this waxing romantic, coupled with some overtly sexual ogling, that Stintz realized why Evelina had disrobed for him. There in her chest was a small hatch, just between her breasts. It had a small brass knob, the size of his little finger's fingernail, and the hatch itself was maybe 4 inches high and 3 inches wide. The craftsmanship to make it blend into her light caramel skin was astounding. He studied it intensely. She saw him doing so and moved even closer. She pulled his hands up, putting one over each of her breasts and beckoning him to lean forward. Stintz instinctively jerked back. She had been right, of course. This was far more intimate. He'd never allowed anyone but maintenance craftsmen to touch his amending. That just was not done, and yet here she was begging him to do so. What else was there to do then? He slid his left hand up to her right shoulder for balance, met her eyes, and pulled the little hatch open with his right, swinging the door open from his right to left, her left to right. Inside was ticking. He let his eyes slide back down to the now open space in her chest, and he didn't quite know what he was encountering. It wasn't gear work. It wasn't pipework or plumbing. It wasn't steamwork or combustibles. It wasn't that new biotech that the engineer was saying was the salvation of tomorrow's man. It was just a small boxy triangle with a 2.5-inch flat metal arrow steadily pacing left and right and left and right and left and right. Stintz did recognize a small winder at the base of the device, so he knew Evelina would need to be wound, just like him. He went to ask what it was, but, as one's true love should, she already knew what he was going to ask.
Metronome. It is a metronome. It measures out my everything, my love. It winds down rather quickly, so I am to be rather mindful of where I am and what I am doing throughout my days. The pacing of my life is dictated by this little device. Currently, it is regulated to 59 beats per minute. Were I to want to compete in strenuous activity, running or sexual activity for example, I would need to click the beats per minute setting on the right side. Oh, your left side, dearest, and speed up my pacing.
Stintz was shocked. Evelina's amendment was anything but convenient. This sort of change was generally done in the older, darker days as punishment or a last resort. His mind raced and leapt, trying to create scenarios in which this woman would have had this done to her. He was failing miserably. At least this explained a lot to him. Her ultra-conservative dresses, her clipped speech that so many found too formal, too halting, too rhythmic, too measured, her steady pacing of walking. A stroll was a stroll with Evelina, to be sure, but there were days when she did not slow down. She must have had her beats per minute increased on those days.
Stintz?
He jolted, realizing he was staring with his mouth agape and not saying anything to her. Yes, yes, Evie.
I know that this is not the sort of amending that any man would seek out in a partner with whom he planned on spending any amount of his resources. Logically, you wish to ask how often I must be wound. I can generally get away with every 4 hours, but the craftwork is aging, so it sometimes lessens to as low as every 3 hours. However, even with all that being what it is, I hope that you can mitigate the off-putting nature of my amending by way of balancing against all the fun and the good times we have had together since our first meeting in the rainstorm under the awning at the bank, because,
Evie, do you think I'm going to end our relationship? That I'm going to break up with you?
Well, logically, this amendment is rather, shall we say, conspicuous in my life. Though you support the engineer and the amended fervently, I do not think that even one such as yourself would seek out such a backwardly amended young woman.
Evie! Stop! He smiled. I love you. I loved you, if I'm being honest, from that first moment I saw you. And yes, I'm fully aware that you think such sentiment is drivel and hyperbole and an impossibility, but I, for one, am looking quite forward to spending a lifetime proving you wrong on this one, my love. I think our natural next step is for you to show me how to care for your... was it called a metronome? And I will show you how my own gear system works. In fact, why don't we do it right now? Evie beamed up at Stents, her neck cocked just enough to overcome the 3 inches in height difference when both were unshodden. Her face-splitting grin wasn't necessarily out of character, but it certainly was not all too common. He had made her happy. That face-splitting grin quickly saw her deep brown eyes become something akin to sinister, and that smile wrinkle up in a strange way that almost scared Stents. She reached up and took his hand again, placing it on the side of her metronome with the beats per minute regulator. She guided his hand to the little slide switch, pushing it up to 150 while never breaking her stare. She then held his hand, allowing them both to shut her hatch together. Evelina gently pushed Stents then, forcing him to fall backward onto her generic sofa. She languidly walked forward, allowing her dress to fall from her hips and hit the floor. The clicking of her metronome tapped out a beat that resounded oddly, loudly in the small apartment. It beat out the rhythm of both of their lives for the next 2 hours, and, as far as the two could see on this gorgeous evening, in this special moment, for the rest of their days. Thank you for listening to The Amended, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. All of the many sounds and tracks of music you hear come from 3 wonderful sites dedicated to improving artists' audio content. They are freesound.org, the Free Music Archive at freemusicarchive.org, and freepd.com. These tracks and audio effects are being used under CC 0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. Next up this week, stay tuned for a different take on one of the major events of Shakespeare's Hamlet in Lame. Lame, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. God, this is lame. The murky water filling her lungs, Ophelia rolled her eyes as she sank down. Her layer upon layer of proper lady's dress might as well have been steel shackles. An appropriate metaphor, she thought, even as her eyes began to flicker and her thoughts began to muddy in those final moments before involuntary aspiration began. Yeah, she knew how drowning worked. Everyone always thought she was stupid, helpless. That could not have been further from the truth. She did, however, suffer from the poison that she had swallowed willingly, gratefully even. Love. Psst, what a load of horseshit. She had been so enamored with the damned prince for as long as she could remember. Day in and day out, she would imagine their life together. Of course, she would inevitably and eventually become queen of all the Danes. That was a nice little portion of that fantasizing, but really, her focus was much more on the unbelievable connection she and the prince shared. The idle times they spent with one another were golden. The time they were apart? Those were the most cliched swaths of heart-rending torture she could have ever dreamt up for bad poetry or even worse prose. Her father and her brother's warnings about just how much of a bad boy the prince was didn't help the situation either. He runs around with all the women he can, this, and He is 2 bad days away from needing to be committed to the Abbey for mental treatment. That.
Again, horseshit. Ophelia understood what these two were trying to do, and she even credited them for doing so. Chastity was a virtue, to be sure, but it was also an undebatable necessity and inarguable commodity. A commodity that a young woman must possess should she have any desire to be much of anything in this patently unfair world. A necessity that a young woman must possess should she have any drive to land a man worth the having. Again, the only way for her to do much of anything in this patently unfair world. So, when her dear prince returned, she'd been happy. It was high time that the both of them marry, and why shouldn't they get married to one another after so many years of affection they shared? Then, the prince seemed to be devoid of those feelings all of a sudden, acting quite strangely around her. He strutted and fretted around the castle, yelling and dressing solely in black. She was a bit sympathetic toward him, of course, what with all of his strangeness coming only in the wake of his father's death. Hell, she thought that maybe, just maybe, she would be queen all the more quickly, assuming the prince would rise to the throne and immediately reach out to take her hand. After all, an unmarried king sits very shakily on the throne. The throne was not his to have immediately, as it turned out, though. The king's queen married the king's brother, making for a new, boorish man sitting the throne. She thought all the oddities of her beloved's behavior were excusable, with all this in mind. This did not mean that she did not stay up night after night wondering at her own fate and the future of their relationship. Then, horror of all horrors, her brother gone and her already on edge, her by all accounts future husband accidentally murdered her father. That stuck in her craw just a bit too much to be brushed off. Now, her father was a bit overbearing. If she were being fair, he was a bit of a conniving, long-winded dick, but he was her father. He loved her. She loved him. He'd always wanted nothing but the best for Ophelia. A steel through the heart, be it accidental or not, simply would not do for a husband-to-be's behavior. Everyone thought she snapped. Was she tired? Yes. Was she a bit preoccupied with, at least in her own mind, planning a funeral and an inevitable wedding? Yes. How was that crazy? The stresses of all of that, and with the various bits and baubles of palace intrigue, continued to keep her up. She went night after horrific night without sleep. Admittedly, she had begun to hallucinate, hearing and seeing things by the morning she had made her way to the willow tree by the brook. She was out collecting flowers, an activity that helped calm her mind and quell her restless spirit in the face of all the fire and fury that the world seemed to offer up in spades of late. A little bit too sharp an angle here, a little bit too much forward momentum there. Her equilibrium was far from on point. What with all the sleep she'd lost these past couple weeks. When was the last time she'd actually slept a night through? It had to be well before those damned players showed up to perform that poorly written piece about poisonings in royal gardens. Surely, the playwright must have been simple. At any rate, angle, momentum, equilibrium. The bottom line was that, when reaching out to grab, well, something, she fell over into the brook. And now here she was, slowly sinking to the bottom, thanks to a potent combination of leaden layers of lace and petticoats and frilly dresses, and her strength that had been extremely diminished due to fatigue. All the flashbacks that people spoke of for those that had faced death and come back to speak of it seemed like tall tales. Her vision was blackening quickly,
and she didn't feel like she was reliving her entire life or going somewhere pleasant. Instead, she had a couple brief moments to think back on the past month or so, ponder her mistakes made within that month, and lament the idiotic narrative that the vapid queen, dipshit king, and her hot-blooded, slightly slow brother would put together about this scene when they found her floating like one of her beloved lilies here in the brook. Why did they call this a brook anyway? Gods, this fucking thing was not deeper than any damn brook has any business being. And oh! Right, her poor poetic prince! Him! He would write elegies and eulogies and music and diatribes about this macabrely romantic scene. Sylvan pieces were all the rage this season, and he was too emotional to let this one go. Even before he decided to lose himself in thought and poetics, detaching from the real world and her, he had been overly dramatic. God damn, this was lame. Pops of color began to show behind her eyes. Her lungs were full of water now. When did that happen? She just knew they'd talk about how fucking beautiful she was. She just knew it. Thank you for listening to Lame, an original short story by me, Jared I. McGee. The tracks you hear in the background of this story all come from the Free Music Archive, which can be found at freemusicarchive.org. They are all being used under CC 0 1.0 Universal Public Domain dedication licenses. Well, that does it for yet another episode of Prose this week. We will be back in 2 weeks' time, that is on December the 2nd, for our next episode. I surely hope that you'll join us. As always, I also am hoping that you'll remember to love those around you. Tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always, stranger than fiction. See you next time, and thank you for listening.